Welcome to another session in which we'll continue to explore the works of the early 19th century fiction writer, Sir Walter Scott. We're going to introduce you to the one novel which, for well over a century, has endeared him to readers the world over. The novel is Ivanhoe, a romantic adventure set in the times of King Richard's England, when noble heroes like Robin Hood fought for the right and the good, and corrupt tyrants like Prince John fought to overthrow the righteous. Ivanhoe contains all the classic story elements of the historic romance: duels and kidnappings, beautiful virtuous heroines and brave knights, castles and forests, and battles of both sword and ideals, all of which provide the setting in which good triumphs over evil once again. Ivanhoe is a brilliant example of the art form Scott invented and pioneered, the historic novel. We'll begin with a brief summary of Ivanhoe and its importance to literature. Following that, you'll be ready for the book itself. We'll introduce you to the main characters, and then we'll guide you through a detailed review of the story. Finally, we'll offer a brief analysis of the story, its message and moral, and the qualities which gave it such universal and lasting appeal. Let us start then with a summary of the work and its contribution to the history of literature. Ivanhoe was an attempt by Scott to broaden his scope. It was the first story he set in England, and it was to become the most famous and influential of all his works. Ivanhoe was originally published in 1819 in 3 volumes as the 10th novel in the Waverley series. Scott was still writing anonymously, although much of the public had by then guessed his identity. The book was an immediate success, selling more copies than any of Scott's previous works. Scott said he took the name of Ivanhoe from an ancient ballad about the conflict between 2 nobles in England. If so, it was an appropriate choice. Ivanhoe is centered around the cultural and racial conflict between the Normans and Saxons, who shared residence of King Richard's England during the time of the Crusades. To fully understand the story, it helps to have a little historic background on this conflict. When Germanic and Scandinavian people invaded Britain after the end of Roman occupation, they intermarried with the Celtic natives of Britain. The offspring of this mix were called Anglo-Saxons or Saxons. The Saxons regarded themselves as the owners, rulers, and true natives of Britain. They formed a monarchy and developed their own culture. But in the year 1066, William the Conqueror, who ruled French-speaking Normandy across the Channel, led an invasion into the British mainland. He was victorious. The Normans immediately replaced the Saxon culture with their own, and the antagonism between the 2 cultures persisted for many generations. The Normans became the wealthy ruling class, and the Saxons lost most of their privileges and many of their rights. The lead character of Scott's book, Ivanhoe, is a knight whose father is a Saxon. His father has disowned him for joining the Crusades because King Richard, worthy or not, is still a Norman. As the story opens, Ivanhoe has returned to England disguised as a pilgrim. He hopes to reapproach his alienated father and to also approach his father's ward, the lovely and virtuous Rowena, with whom he has been in love for many years. There are others who have desires on the fair Rowena: scurrilous and vile Norman nobles, faithful to the treacherous Prince John, who hopes to usurp his brother's throne before he returns from the Crusades. In his brother's absence, Prince John has been gleefully oppressing and torturing the Saxons, which has, of course, done nothing to promote feelings of goodwill between the already hostile groups. Into this cauldron of conflict and prejudice, Scott introduces 2 characters who are neither Norman nor Saxon, and who serve to make some of the author's key points about bigotry and ignorance. Those characters are an elderly Jewish man named Isaac and his beautiful and brave daughter Rebecca, the latter of whom inevitably falls in love with Ivanhoe. In introducing Rebecca, Sir Walter Scott gave literature one of its most popular heroines. At the time Ivanhoe was published, novels had offered us few female characters of any substance or credibility. The chief characteristics of heroines were their physical beauty and modesty. Rebecca was far more appealing. She blended intelligence, strength, and courage with compassion and an elevated sense of selflessness that can only be described as spiritual. She has therefore remained one of the most popular and inspirational female characters in literature. Critics consider her the best character in the book, and perhaps in all his works, and her abduction is even the subject of a famous painting by the French artist Eugène Delacroix, a contemporary of Scott's. As Ivanhoe proceeds, Scott meets all the promises that a romantic novelist must meet. There are duels between wicked Normans and noble Saxons. The two heroines are both abducted by different villains. Ivanhoe, our hero, performs a rescue. The hero is then reunited with his father. King Richard returns to reclaim his throne. Rowena and Ivanhoe are married. Rebecca does the wise and self-sacrificing thing by departing England, leaving behind the man she will always love. And even Robin Hood appears once or twice, outwitting his Norman competitors at an archery match. In the end, as is the custom with Scott and other romanticists, the powers of darkness are defeated. The rich characters, romantic settings, and provocative conflicts in Ivanhoe have made it the most famous and influential of Scott's works. Ivanhoe, like most of Scott's fiction, recreated history in a way that made it accessible and appealing to a mass audience. It is a key reason that Sir Walter Scott is considered a critical figure in the development and expansion of the novel. The novel Ivanhoe is an essential part of the legacy Scott left behind. It was written in 1818 when he was bedridden with a painful illness that caused severe stomach cramps. At the time, Scott couldn't even hold a pen, so the entire book was dictated to a secretary. It was originally published in 3 volumes in 1819 and immediately was a huge success. Set in 12th century England, Ivanhoe is the first of his stories to take place entirely outside of Scotland, and it contains some of his most memorable and vibrant characters. Among them, Richard the Lion-Hearted, the beautiful and brave Rebecca, and the evil knight Sir Brian de Bois-Guilbert. Ivanhoe was the first novel to bring the romantic times of medieval England into colorful and detailed relief, and its exciting narrative, complete with battles, tournaments, and abductions, has captured the imaginations of many generations. But Ivanhoe is more than a thrilling adventure into the past. It is also an attempt by Scott to contrast the high ideals of the age of chivalry with the brutal and tragic consequences of these ideals. It is an exploration of loyalties, to God, to king, to country, to precepts, to fellow human beings. And ultimately it is a condemnation of narrow and fixed loyalties and of the biases upon which loyalties are based. In Ivanhoe, as in many of Scott's works, one can see the influence of Shakespeare, Homer, Chaucer, Goethe, and the Italian poet Ariosto. His plotting techniques, his narrative form, and even specific events and character traits can be traced back to classic authors. But the resulting product is entirely Scott's own and includes many of his personal techniques, including the parallel scene. The parallel scene occurs when the author switches back and forth from different events happening at the same time. For 4 chapters in Ivanhoe, Scott describes 4 different scenes which actually occur simultaneously, and he unites them by a special technique, in this case, a bugle call. The same bugle call is repeated at the end of 2 chapters, suggesting the parallels between them and preparing us to consider them in the same time frame. Scott also pioneered another technique in the novel, the technique of describing a scene, in this case a battle, through the eyes of a character observing it. Other writers had used the technique before Scott, but he was the first to adapt it to the novel. Such techniques are characteristic of Scott's inventive style, but the greatest contribution of Ivanhoe is still as the first great historic novel, and its rich treasure of romantic characters and daring deeds. There are over 60 characters in Ivanhoe, but only a dozen or so are key players. Before we begin a review of the story, you'll need to familiarize yourself with them, and if you can, to remember which are Normans and which are Saxons, since race is the foundation for the dramatic conflicts which follow. The main characters are Cedric of Rotherwood. Cedric is an old man, a Saxon living under Norman rule, and a leader in the Saxon community. He is the father of our hero, Ivanhoe, and guardian of the beautiful Rowena. Cedric is a man with strong opinions, who staunchly holds on to the past, when Saxons were at their glory, and who lives for the day when that glory will be returned. To that purpose, he has pinned his hopes on Athelstane, the only living descendant of the royal Saxon line. It is his goal to see Athelstane made king, even though Athelstane is a weak, lazy, and coarse character. Cedric has promised the hand of his ward Rowena to Athelstane, even though Rowena is in love with Ivanhoe. To remedy this, Cedric simply disinherited Ivanhoe, a task made easier by the fact that his only son had followed King Richard, a Norman, off to the Crusades. Rowena, the ward of Cedric and beloved of Ivanhoe, a fair-haired, blue-eyed beauty with royal Saxon blood, who is described by Scott as pious, proud, noble, and generous. She is admired and desired by the book's villains, including Maurice de Bracy. Wilfrid of Ivanhoe. Like Rowena, he is blond and blue-eyed. He is the Saxon son of Cedric, but has been disowned for his loyalty to the Norman King Richard. He is hated by villain Bois Guilbert simply because he's a Saxon and a superior knight. Ivanhoe is loved by both the book's heroines, Rowena and Rebecca. Richard of England, the high-spirited Norman king who wants to end discrimination between Normans and Saxons, but who instead has charged off on the Crusades and left his kingdom in the hands of his corrupt brother John. He is described in the book by a disloyal Norman in this way: "A true knight-errant he, and will wander in wild adventures, trusting the prowess of his single arm, while the weighty affairs of his kingdom slumber, and his own safety is endangered." Prince John, the unscrupulous, vain, and greedy brother of King Richard, who will ascend the throne of England within 6 years after this book ends. Briand de Bois Guilbert, also known as the Templar. Bois Guilbert is the main antagonist in Ivanhoe. He is a Knight Templar, an ex-crusader with aspirations of political power. He is ambitious and amoral, hates Ivanhoe, and is determined to have the beautiful Rebecca as his mistress. Reginald Front de Boeuf, a neighbor of Ivanhoe's father Cedric, and a terrifying and evil Norman baron who joins forces with de Bracy to kidnap Rowena. He is also a confederate of Bois Guilbert, the sinister Norman who hates Ivanhoe. Maurice de Bracy. Of the 3 villains in the story, Front de Boeuf, Bois Guilbert, and de Bracy is clearly the most benign. His fatal flaw is his consuming passion for Rowena, which leads him into certain disreputable acts, but to his credit he is also uncooperative with Prince John, and even helps Ivanhoe on occasion. Isaac of York, a Jewish moneylender and merchant who is the father of Rebecca. He represents the Jews who emigrated to Europe in the Middle Ages and were met with hostility and cruel prejudice. This discrimination by Christians led many of the emigrating Jews to return to Moslem lands, such as Spain, for safety. Rebecca, Isaac's daughter, a Jewess, a dark and passionate beauty who is in love with Ivanhoe and who possesses great spirit, virtue, and compassion. Bois Guilbert is mad with desire for her and eventually abducts her. The story of Ivanhoe opens in a forest in England at the time when King Richard has been absent for many years on the Crusades and was believed to be in captivity. During his absence, the country was under the oppressive rule of his brother John and Norman barons who believed themselves superior to the native Saxons. Through the forest pass 2 servants of Cedric of Rotherwood, Ivanhoe's father. They are overtaken by Norman horsemen, one of whom is the Templar, Briand de Bois Guilbert. Bois Guilbert is described as dark and fierce, a man who instills awe and fear. The horsemen ask directions to Cedric's house, but the servants deliberately point the wrong way. The Normans set out in the wrong direction, and we learn that the motive for their visit is that Bois Guilbert is anxious to set eyes on the renowned beauty Rowena, Cedric's ward. He's made a bet that she can't be as beautiful as men claim she is. On their way, the Normans encounter a pilgrim, just returned from the Holy Land, and he corrects their path and sends them in the right direction towards Cedric of Rotherwood. Within the hall at Rotherwood, Cedric awaits dinner. He's described as a man of about 60, with a quick humor and a quick temper. In one of those tempers, he disowned his son Ivanhoe because he had fallen in love with his ward Rowena, and because he had joined King Richard, a Norman, on his crusades. Now he is melancholy. He exclaims, "Ah, Wilfrid, Wilfrid, couldst thou have ruled thine unreasonable passions, thy father had not been left in his age like the solitary oak that throws out its shattered and unprotected branches against the full sweep of the tempest." Cedric's dinner is interrupted by the arrival of the Templar and his party, and by the pilgrim. He is distressed when his ward, the Lady Rowena, also appears, because he notices that the Templar directs a bold and leering glance towards her. As the meal continues, yet another guest arrives. This time it is Isaac of York, a bent, elderly Jewish man seeking shelter from a storm. Isaac is treated with disdain by everyone present except the pilgrim, who helps warm and feed him. The Templar is bragging about his order's skills in the crusade when the pilgrim rises to defend the English who accompanied Richard, pointing out that they had defeated the Knights of the Templar in a tournament. It emerges that one of these victorious Englishmen was the Knight of Ivanhoe. At the mention of Ivanhoe, Rowena's face fills with love, Cedric's face reveals both pride and bitterness, and the furious Templar challenges the absent Ivanhoe to yet another tournament, this time in England. The pilgrim accepts on behalf of Ivanhoe. The next morning the pilgrim warns Isaac that the Templar has ordered his men to seize the old man when he leaves Cedric's estate. Isaac is terrified, and the pilgrim vows to help him. He escorts Isaac as far as Sheffield, where he can find companions to safeguard him to Ashby de la Zouche, the scene of an upcoming tournament. In thanks, Isaac obtains a horse and armor for the pilgrim. Soon, all the main characters find themselves at Ashby for the tournament. Isaac is there with his beautiful daughter Rebecca, and is treated with scorn again by both Saxons and Normans. The tournament begins, and after 4 encounters, the Normans are still unconquered. But suddenly, an unknown enters the games. He calls himself the Disinherited Knight, and personally challenges Bois Guilbert, handily defeating him. The mysterious knight wins the day's honors, but refuses to raise his visor when it's time to accept his prize. He leaves at Rowena's feet the coronet of the Queen of Love and Beauty. The next day the knight sends part of his winnings, a purse of gold, to Isaac to repay him for the horse and armor he gave him. We now know that the Disinherited Knight and the pilgrim are one and the same. Rebecca returns the purse of gold to the pilgrim's attendant, Gurth, telling him to repay his master and to keep what is left for himself. The following afternoon there is another tournament, in which all the knights compete. At one point, the Disinherited Knight is in grave danger because he is attacked simultaneously by 3 knights, including the Templar and Front de Boeuf. He is saved at the last minute by another knight, tall and dressed in black armor, who disappears after the rescue as mysteriously as he arrived. Prince John is forced to give the day's award to the Disinherited Knight, who collapses at the feet of Rowena. The attendants remove his helmet, and lo and behold, the Disinherited Knight is none other than Ivanhoe. In the confusion that follows, Ivanhoe's friends quickly whisk him off. Now it is time for the archery contest, which is won by an archer dressed in Lincoln green, who turns out to be Locksley, or as he's more commonly known, Robin Hood. That night, the Norman noble Maurice de Bracy, who has fallen in love with Rowena and her riches, devises a plan to abduct her. Bois Guilbert is to pose as an outlaw and take Rowena to Front de Boeuf's castle, where de Bracy will perform a rescue. The following morning, Cedric and his company are traveling home when they hear cries in the forest and happen upon Isaac and Rebecca, who have been deserted by their bodyguard. Cedric agrees to let them join his party, but soon all are overpowered by an ambush of masked bandits. 2 servants who escape seek help for the party from Locksley. They encounter the Black Knight in the forest, and all set off together for a rendezvous with Locksley's band. The captives have meanwhile been herded off to the castle of Torquilston and locked in separate apartments. Isaac is thrust into a dungeon where he is threatened with torture if he doesn't pay Front de Boeuf 1,000 pounds of silver. When Isaac hears that his daughter Rebecca has been turned over to the amorous Bois Guilbert, he refuses to pay the ransom, but is spared the torture when Front de Boeuf is distracted by the sound of a trumpet. At the same time, de Bracy is pressing his attentions on Rowena, having abandoned his plan of rescuing her. He admits to her that it is he that caused her capture. Rowena is appalled to learn from de Bracy that they have also captured Ivanhoe, and he is now in the hands of the merciless Front de Boeuf. Meanwhile, Rebecca has been approached by the evil Templar, Bois Guilbert, who declares he will make her his mistress. Rebecca leaps onto a parapet and threatens to jump if he pursues his plan. The Templar, too, is interrupted in his suit by the sound of the trumpet. The bugle turns out to be a challenge by the rescuers, who now number 200, including Locksley and his band and the Black Knight. Front de Boeuf says he will execute his captors, and the rescuers may send in a priest to take their confessions. They send in a servant disguised as a friar, and the servant persuades Cedric to don the priestly robes and escape. The besieged Normans gather their defenses, withdrawing Ivanhoe's bodyguards and leaving Rebecca to care for him. Rebecca watches the battle below from a window and reports it to Ivanhoe, still recovering from his wounds. The rescuers battle to enter the castle and see that flames are already rising from it. They find Front de Boeuf already dead. The flames and the murder have been committed by an old woman who was once forced to be the mistress of de Boeff's father, and now sees an opportunity for revenge. The rescuers enter, and the Black Knight defeats de Bracy, but the Templar, Bois Guilbert, has fled with Rebecca, tearing her from Ivanhoe's side. Cedric rushes into the castle and saves Rowena, and the Black Knight saves Ivanhoe. Later, Locksley arranges for an influential prior to write a letter to Bois Guilbert asking for the release of Rebecca. Isaac takes his letter to the head of the order, who is enraged to find out that Bois Guilbert has so strayed from the ideals of the order that he has now secreted a Jewess in the monastery. He takes the view that only a witch could gain such a hold on the Templar, and orders that Rebecca be put to death. But he grants one chance of escape. If a champion will fight for Rebecca against Bois Guilbert and defeat him, then Rebecca will be freed. Isaac rushes off to try and enlist the help of Ivanhoe. Meanwhile, the Black Knight is continuing on his journey when he is attacked in ambush. The assailants prove to be friends of Prince John's, and the Black Knight, who finally removes his helmet, turns out to be none other than King Richard himself. King Richard accompanies Ivanhoe to Cedric's, where he manages to reconcile father and son. Later, he is dismayed to discover that Ivanhoe has been called away by a Jew, Isaac, and fearing trouble, he sets out to follow him. When he finds Ivanhoe, the hero has already defeated Bois Guilbert in combat, and Rebecca is free again. Ivanhoe learns that King Richard, while following him, had met some of his royal followers, and together they had peacefully ousted Prince John and restored the throne of England to its rightful descendant. Next, Cedric agrees to the marriage of Ivanhoe and Rowena. And finally, Rebecca, preparing to leave England for Spain with her father, takes the bride of the man she loves a parting gift of beautiful jewels. Rebecca has decided to dedicate her life to helping the sick and poor. The book ends in peace and harmony, with evil vanquished, and each individual content and reconciled to his own inevitable fate. This, then, is the story of Ivanhoe, the novel that helped establish an innovative new form of literature called the historic romance. Yet hidden within its daring escapades and exciting clashes of brawn and will are themes which reflect issues of timeless relevance to humankind. Perhaps the most apparent theme is that of bigotry, for in Ivanhoe it exists in every character, even our heroes, and it is the main cause of the events and conflicts which unfold before us. To begin with, we have the clear bias of the Normans against the Saxons, and the Saxons against the Normans. Beyond this, we have the bigotry of both Normans and Saxons against the Jewish race, notably represented in this story by Rebecca and her father Isaac. Even our worthy protagonist Ivanhoe is subject to biases towards Rebecca and Isaac, as is the good King Richard. It is only Rebecca herself who seems free of any prejudice and willing to extend her goodwill to any individual of any race or creed. It is another contribution of Scott that he has been called the first writer to give Jewish characters prominence in the English novel. In Ivanhoe, he created Jewish characters who rose above his other characters, whose pacifism, compassion, and sense of honor was far more inspiring than the shallow virtues of their companions in the book, and who emerged as perhaps the only characters who were right, totally and unequivocally right. Therefore, when Rebecca and Isaac leave for Spain at the end of the book, it is an act that is most telling and which delivers a strong commentary on the moral condition of England at the time of the story. Scott clearly feels that England did not deserve Rebecca. Wearied by its cruel disdain for her race and sorrowed by the violence she has seen, Rebecca now seeks a happier, more suitable home, and England, in its ignorance, has lost a true heroine. Bigotry is perhaps the real antagonist in Ivanhoe, but another important theme that Scott explores is that of ideals versus practical reality. He manages to make a mockery of Cedric, the old Saxon who is rooted in the past and unable to adequately deal with the events of the present. He also demonstrates the sharp contrast between heroic chivalry and the acts of brutality and cruelty it invokes. Through Rebecca, he challenges men who vow loyalty to codes of liberty and right and then enforce them with blood and hate. The Crusades themselves offer the perfect example of this kind of misguided idealism. By the end of the novel, the reader is convinced that any fanaticism of thought, no matter how seemingly noble, must fail, because fanaticism itself allows no room for tolerance and compromise. Scott also explores the hypocrisy of religion and the Church by presenting us with knights who belong to holy orders and yet who freely break their vows to pursue their own passions and greed. Although the conclusion of Ivanhoe is on the surface a happy ending, on deeper levels it is pessimistic. The king who returns to his throne will rule inadequately and with little success. His reign will be short. Hatred between Saxons and Normans will continue, and the departure of the gentle Rebecca is an ominous statement about the persistence of discrimination and the racial and religious hatred that is still unresolved. Although Scott is viewed as a romantic, his portrayal of the past is not an attempt to glorify it, but to use it to reflect the problems that still plague modern society. Sir Walter Scott invented a new form of literature, but through that literature he explored themes that are anything but new, which had relevance during the time in which he wrote, and which still have relevance today.
This is the end of the session.